final panel of the day, current issues in sports law, protecting your players, teams, and league. The moderator will be not only a partner at Dickinson, Wright, and the governor of the London Knights, but Trevor Whiffen, one of the organizers of this event. He's not busy enough, so we thought, you can moderate a panel too. So that's what he'll do. Dave Goldstein is the COO of the CFL, formerly the COO of U Sports, and before that he practiced commercial real estate law and sports law. Jeff Jackson, he played 269 NHL games. He took law at Western, interned for the NHL Senior VP of Hockey Operations, and practiced corporate law, and he's now a certified NHLPA agent and the VP of Hockey at Wasserman and the Orr Group. And Sarah Eve Pelletier is the Deputy General Counsel and Director of Business Affairs at the Canadian Olympic Committee. So she's responsible for negotiating sponsorship arrangements to support Team Canada's brand and revenue. She also competed as a member of Canada's synchro team, 3-time Canadian champ. There you go. Nice. So this is our final panel, current issues in sports law. Trevor?
Thanks, Caroline. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending today and for staying right till the end. It's a lot of content over the course of the day, and I know it really is a very draining day even for us, so I appreciate you hanging in there. Thank you to our panelists for participating in this year's conference. They've all distinguished themselves in both the area of sports and in the area of law. I'm often asked by young lawyers how it is that you get to become a sports lawyer or get involved in sports law. And as the resumes of these three individuals will indicate, no two career paths are the same and no one has a straight line to the place that they are at now. My advice to all of you who are interested in getting involved either in sports law or in sports generally is get involved, network, do your homework, meet the people that you need to meet who do the things that you want to do, and seize the opportunity when it comes along, and be prepared when it comes along. So you have to know your stuff and not miss that opportunity. This year, I'd like to focus on two significant developments that happened in the past year. We were going to talk about some licensing issues, but that last panel actually covered a lot of the areas that we were going to cover, so we may give that a miss. But I want to talk about the decriminalization of cannabis in Canada and the approach that's been taken by various sports organizations, and secondly, the expansion of legalized sports betting in the United States and how that will impact on sports betting in Canada and throughout various sports leagues. So with a show of hands, how many people here were in favor of the decriminalization of cannabis in October of 2018? Some reluctant tokers in the crowd. Yeah. Guys, nobody's filming you. You can be honest about it. Okay, by another show of hands, how many of you at that moment thought, geez, what's the impact of this in terms of the world of sports? Anybody? Come on, you knew. Maybe I should have asked that differently. That was a setup. You knew what the answer to that question had to be. Well, this distinguished panel is going to help us work through the various implications of the legalization of cannabis in Canada and talk about how it's being handled by various sports organizations. So I'm going to start first with Sarah, who's with the Canadian Olympic Committee, and tell us what the impact of decriminalization has been at both the COC, Canadian Olympic Committee level, and the IOC, and for athletes that are competing on the world stage.
So I think we were among those that raised our hands to the second question, because at first it was not so obvious for our organization what the impact of decriminalization would have. Soon enough, we had to ask ourselves those questions and to try to find answers, because athletes were asking the questions as well as our national sports organization. And quite frankly, I would say it's a year after, it's been a bit over a year, and not much has changed for us. Quite simply, from an athlete's perspective, the reason why it hasn't changed is because our athletes, when they compete on the world stage and when they compete at the Olympic Games, they are subject to the World Anti-Doping Code and all prohibitions in terms of consumption of performance enhancement drugs. And to this day, cannabis is still considered on the prohibited list for what is called in-competition testing. There are two types of tests, outside of competition and then during competition. And cannabis is still a prohibited substance for in-competition testing. And the second reason why it hasn't impacted the way we treat this prohibition is because while it may now be legal in Canada to consume, it's still very much illegal in a lot of the countries where we do compete. If we look towards the next Olympic Games destination, Tokyo, in 2020, in Japan, it can be up to 5 years imprisonment for a possession or distribution of cannabis. And that's certainly not a position we would want any of our athletes to be put into. So what it means for us is that we put a lot of our efforts toward education, awareness, and making sure that our delegation know of their obligations and they can make an informed decision as to how they go about it.
What is the official position taken by the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sports, and share with us how that body governs and enforces drug violations in Canada? Because I think some of us kind of wonder how it interfaces with WADA.
Yep. So for those of you who may not know who CCS is, they are the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sports, and they are what is considered under the World Anti-Doping Code a NATO, so a National Anti-Doping Organization, and they are responsible for the implementation of the Canadian Anti-Doping Program. As a signatory of the code, they cannot go and prescribe different regulations than what the World Anti-Doping Code says, so they have to align themselves with the rules that are prevalent on a worldwide basis, and they actually implement the program in Canada according to those international standards and rules. The CCES has expressed in the past, and I don't want to speak on their behalf, but they have expressed in the past some hesitation in terms of whether cannabis should be considered performance-enhancing substance. That said, there have been some accounts of individual athletes who may have said that while it's not helping their performance, it's helping their recovery, stress management, anxiety, and so forth. So for a substance to be considered a prohibited substance, it needs to meet 3 criteria. It needs to be performance enhancement and or be harmful to health and or being contrary to the spirit of sport. So based on these 3 criteria, the World Anti-Doping Agency still consider cannabis to meet at least 2 of these 3 criteria. From the health perspective, we could say or argue that cannabis is harmful to the youth. So from that perspective, it's still a good rationale to keep it prohibited. As well as you can imagine, someone being impaired in certain sports may create a risk for themselves as well as with other athletes on the field of play. So these, from a health perspective, are other reasons why it's still considered. So that would be, I don't want to speak on CCS behalf, but they have a mitigated position in terms of cannabis as a substance. That said, they are enforcing the regulations as a NATO in Canada.
Thank you. Dave, over to you. You've recently joined the Canadian Football League, but spent a number of years with U Sports. What is the position taken by both U Sports and the Canadian Football League with regard to cannabis use?
So it's an interesting contrast, and it's not an uncommon one, a contrast between professional leagues and amateur sports. So a professional league has a players' association to negotiate with, a union, and it has the luxury of essentially designing its own drug plan. So at the CFL, we have a drug policy. That drug policy deals with performance-enhancing drugs specifically, and it doesn't deal with recreational drugs. So whether or not a player has used marijuana, cocaine, setting aside legality or illegality, that's not something that our testing reports to us, and that's not something that a player would be punished for. So as long as they're within the law, and I should point out, within workplace requirements. So when this first came out, there were lots of questions about what's this going to mean, not just in sports, but in workplaces. You can't show up for work drunk, even though that's been legal forever. So you also can't show up for work high. That's not any different in sports and otherwise. But as far as punishing a player, as long as they're within the law and as long as they're within their workplace obligations, it's not something that that is a CFL issue internally, domestically. Obviously, there's cross-border and all of that. U Sports was a very different scenario and a really interesting one for me as a learning experience. The decriminalization definitely had an impact. And for a lot of the reasons that were mentioned, U Sports is a signatory with the CCES to an agreement where we contract with CCES to oversee the anti-doping testing and enforcement. And as part of that, it means we're a signatory to WADA. So notwithstanding what's legal or illegal here, it's about what's permitted or not permitted under the World Anti-Doping Code. And as Sarah mentioned, not only is cannabis illegal in some places, it's very illegal. It's unethical. It's viewed very differently from here. So our student athletes in Canada are governed by that WADA code. And the consequence can be, and it's a severe one, CCES doesn't view cannabis as performance enhancing. Canada doesn't view cannabis as illegal, and we have 15,000 student athletes in Canada at the U Sports level, many of whom are playing really at a high level recreational level. They don't have any illusions of going pro. They don't have illusions of going to the Olympics. This is a value add to their university experience. And yet if they test positive for a legal, non-performance enhancing substance in competition, they get an anti-doping rule violation, and that stays on their record, and that's something that can be Googleable by their potential employers years down the road. And so that's a real challenge. And that's something that we had an issue with. We dealt with CCES. As I left, one of the things we were working on was, can CCES lobby to change that classification so that it won't have that same impact, specifically for, again, these tens of thousands of student athletes, where it just doesn't make a lot of sense. So it's a very different view on the same issue, and an interesting contrast, again, between amateur and pro sports.
So Dave, what would be the rationale for youth sports to subject itself to the CCES regime if there are such dire consequences for people who are, to just use your term, participating at a recreational level? Why subject yourself to that?
I think it's a couple things. Number one, when you are committed to anti-doping and clean sport, there's a benefit to the gold standard, right? And that's WADA, and that's CCES, and that's the full program. This is a very unique wrinkle that is a bit of a counterintuitive result. But there's something about the gold standard. And secondly, when you're an amateur sport organization with very, very limited resources, as U Sports is, you don't have the luxury of a tailor-made, self-designed, exactly what you want program. Your option is contract with CCES and have them do what they do, or not. And it's not necessarily something where you have the choice to tailor it and to cater it exactly. So it's a combination of practical and I'd say principle.
How prevalent is cannabis use in the CFL? Do you have any empirical data about that? There have been unofficial studies in the US that said in the NFL, as high as 80% of all players are self-medicating for the purposes that Sarah suggested, speeding up recovery and dealing with the stress of the game.
Yeah, I'll plead the new guy card here. I'm 2 months in, literally, so I can't say that I know that yet. I do know that our Alumni Association is actually actively engaged in doing medical research. One of the big things I think that's still disputed is the long-term impact, and I think while it's been decriminalized and there's a rush to kind of stamp it as good for you and better than alternatives, and let's prescribe it and let's do all these things, generally speaking, I think if you ask some of the highest level doctors, they'll tell you there's just a lot of unknowns still. And so I know our alumni are actively involved in that. We're actively looking at that, but I don't know the numbers.
Still with you, Dave. Randy Ambrosi, your commissioner, when it was decriminalized a year ago, he came out publicly and said that the CFL may embrace the use of cannabis. He made reference to if it was good for the community. And it wasn't completely clear what he meant by that, but what is the official position of the CFL as a league now with regard to the use of cannabis?
Well, again, if you're within the limits of the law and you're within your workplace policies as an employee, this is not something where we're going to step in and punish you. As far as taking that a step further and looking at business partnerships or sponsorships or things like that, it's a to be determined. Part of that is internally discussing, again, the long-term health benefits or risks. And secondly, again, Health Canada will have another layer of layer of complexity to this, where advertising for cannabis or sponsoring cannabis is different than advertising for a carbonated beverage or an orange juice or whatever other CPG product. So there is another layer to it.
Going to turn to Jeff. Now, Jeff is a prominent player agent. We didn't mention in his bio, but Connor McDavid, perhaps you've heard of him, is one of Jeff's clients, and feel free to offer other clients that are part of your stable with the Orr Group. But Jeff has been around a long time, and represents a number of high-profile clients. In the NHL, what is the official status of cannabis as a banned or permitted substance?
Well, in the NHL, cannabis is not a banned substance. They focus more on performance-enhancing drugs, just like the other leagues. And it's a player safety issue more than anything else. They don't test for it per se, and you're not susceptible to suspension. But if you're tested and you have a abnormally high level of THC in your urine, such that it might cause a problem for either yourself or another player in competition, then you're referred to the doctor, to the drug program, at least to explore what's going on with the player. Typically, teams, agents, if a player is at that point with usage of cannabis, you would know about it and you would have dealt with it already.
So it's been decriminalized in Canada, and the NHL doesn't consider it a banned substance. But from a practical perspective, if you're a Canadian-based player crossing into the United States, many states of which have not legalized the use of cannabis, how does that impact on player transfers across the border, either for trades or for just participating in games south of the border?
Well, at the end of the day, the player has to be very diligent. If you're a player that uses CBD or cannabis, and you're traveling across the border for your job, you do not want to put yourself in jeopardy. Your whole career could be at risk because whether it's legal in Canada or not, it doesn't matter. Federally in the U.S., as you know, it's not. Some states it's legal. So we try to educate our players. I think the NHLPA does a fantastic job in their education programs, making sure the players realize the potential for problems. In the NHL, the teams all travel by private charter. They don't go through normal custom procedures. So I think players, management, you can get a little bit comfortable and lazy about the way you cross the border. So I think the thing that we try to drive home is don't forget you're still subject to the same rules that everybody else is, and you may have a border official who wants to go through the plane, and if you get caught or you've forgotten about something like a CBD oil or something, you could be in jeopardy.
And not just for that trip or that transfer across the border, but for subsequent trips into the United States, presumably.
Yeah, you might be banned from traveling to the U.S., which would be a really bad thing for an NHL player.
To say the least. Jeff, this is not necessarily a legal question, but even though cannabis is legal in Canada, from a practical perspective, how do you think team officials would view players if they knew them to be active cannabis users? Like, does that change their perspective on the candidacy of a guy that they might sign for free agency? And Burke, I know you're going to have an opinion, so I'll wait in, but we'll let Jeff go first.
I think that it's like anything else. When teams are assessing players, they look at all kinds of things. They look at obviously their skill level, their performance, their mental toughness, their leadership, all of those things. So if a player is a cannabis user, and again, it depends, there's a major distinction between using CBD as a pain relief or for sleep or whatever versus someone who's smoking pot and out late at night partying. I mean, that guy is not going to be somebody that an NHL team would want in any event. They want players who are committed to playing, to showing up for work every day, being professionals, not having a negative influence on their teammates, on the team in general. So I don't think that alcohol is a drug, and same analysis. If Brian Burke's running a hockey team and he's got a player who he knows to be someone who over participates in drinking and is out late at night the night before a game or whatever, he's not going to want that guy on his team. So it's the same with this.
Brian, do you want to weigh in on that?
Oh, that's exactly right.
Yeah. Switching gears a little bit, Jeff, but on the same topic, how do you think, or how in your experience do you feel known use of cannabis by a player will impact on their commercial brand and their availability or eligibility for endorsement opportunities, commercial opportunities?
I don't know. It's so early in this thing with legalization in Canada. There's a prohibition, obviously, in Canada for marketing and sponsorship of cannabis products. So I know that you're talking in generally with a brand, but again, I think there's so much science to still be determined on the effectiveness of this stuff. I think it comes down to if you've got a player at a certain point in his career when this gets a little bit more clear scientifically, there won't be any issue. It'll be something that's just accepted. But at this point, I think it's really too early. Again, to my earlier point, if you're using cannabis products and you're partying, then you've got an issue with your brand. So if you're using it quietly as a pain relief or sleep aid, then you're probably not going to be impacted.
All right, let's switch gears here and move on to the legalization of gambling in the United States and how that's going to impact on sports in the United States and how you also think it may foreshadow what will happen in Canada. I'm going to start with Sarah. Lotteries have been used for a lot of years to raise funds for sports activities, including the 76 Olympics in Montreal. So what's the official position of the COC and the IOC with regard to the legalization of gaming and gambling activities generally?
I think we need to distinguish the two aspects. So you're right. I can remember being a young athlete and local bingo being the solo source of our local club, source of revenue generation. And that is the case for most parents probably in the room, local bingos. There's an element of the concept of lotteries, the concept of gaming that is crucial and essential to the success of very small sport organizations. If we put it at a large scale, lotteries in the UK, for example, fund direct to athletes grants. So UK Sport is the main hub of high performance sports in the country, and they're half funded by government and half funded by national lottery. So national lottery, and that's the same case in France as well. So La Française des Jeux contributed, I believe, 2 million euros. So back to your example around the 76 games. So La Française des Jeux contributed 2 million euros to the candidature of Paris for the 2024 games. So for certain lotteries, national lotteries or provincial lotteries are omnipresent or are present in the funding of sport organizations at different level. In terms of the Olympic movement and the IOC and how it impacts or trickles down to us more directly, it's more around there is a prohibition in place, and it's to protect the integrity of the sports competition and to protect the integrity of the Olympic Games themselves. And so there is a prohibition by those who participate in the Olympic Games, whether it's the athletes themselves or the organizations that are part of the Olympic Games, such as ourselves, the Canadian Olympic Committee, and others in the Olympic movement. There's a prohibition on participants to engage in betting relating or betting gambling as it relates to events of the Olympic Games. And there's a further prohibition to promote any betting activities in association with the Olympic Games. So it's a little bit of a contrast, but that is to protect the integrity of the games themselves. So you would not want a participant in the games who is engaged in a betting activity, because that would completely undermine the integrity of the games. So that is the current state and position.
Dave, all 9 of your teams of the Canadian Football League are located geographically in Canada, so you're all governed by the Canadian criminal code provisions such as they currently are with regard to gaming. But what about the offshore component? And perhaps you could share with us the story that you shared with us last week about youth sports and gaming offshore.
Sure. I think when you look at gambling, and I think especially with the U.S. having decriminalized it or allowed the states to proceed with legalizing it, now there's a push for it to be legalized in Canada. A lot of concerns get raised about, problem gambling, so the risk that people gamble and become addicted. There's risks of match fixing or, paying players, paying referees. All of those things exist right now. All of those risks are very severe right now because of illegal gambling. It happens in huge dollar amounts. When I was at U Sports, our big thing was trying to push our relevance, trying to get people to watch our games. And I found out and kind of laughed at it and kind of was freaked out by it, that there was a tremendous amount of illegal online gambling activity in Asia on youth sports competition. Now, first question that I asked when CCS raised this with me was, are they at least watching our games? They are not. So there's no benefit to this. These were prop bets on random games, random single points, and the rationale was for illegal online gaming, especially overseas, they were looking for leagues or sports products that had integrity and credibility, so there wasn't a concern that games would be fixed. They had to be sporting events that were posted, the results were posted online immediately, and they had to fly a little bit under the radar, so there wasn't a lot of scrutiny on the activity. We checked all three boxes, and so we're huge at U Sports in illegal online betting in Asia. And you know, I laughed about it for a moment, and then it freaks you out a little bit, right? Because there's some risk there. And I'll give an example that wasn't a U Sports one, but it shows the lengths illegal gamblers will go to fix competition. And again, not fix who wins the championship or even who wins the game, but who wins a point. This is a true story that I was told. It was a women's volleyball professional match in Europe, and there was a prop bet on who would win the first point of the match. And illegal gamblers had paid an actress to show up at the game in a wheelchair, sit in the front with a sign that says, "It's my dream to serve 1 point for team so-and-so." And the other team saw it and thought, "Oh, isn't that sweet? Let's let her serve. We'll give them the first point, and we'll continue from there." It's a 5-set match. It's 20-something, like, who cares? She serves, they win the point, someone makes a bundle. So all of these things are happening already. And in my mind, legalizing gambling will actually just mitigate those risks, because right now there's no monitoring of it. No one at that league or no one at U Sports would be flagged about spikes in activity on a given match or on a given point, because we don't know, because it's illegal. But if it's legalized and steps can be put into place, again, those risks are there, but they can be mitigated because you actually have a stake in the game.
And Dave, was this gambling on the Vanier Cup or the men's Final Four of hockey? What level did it go down to?
This is like regular season, non-revenue sport, middle tier to lower teams. I mean, there's nothing to do with the quality of the game, the importance of the game. It's just something reliable, instantaneous, and under the radar that you can bet on. And presumably the theory is, if you win enough of these small prop bets and you do it in a huge enough quantity where someone's just sitting at a computer looking at scoreboards and nothing else, you can make a fortune. So it's really counterintuitive to the way a fan would play, where they want to bet on their favorite team or they want to bet on the big game and add to their experience of watching. This has nothing to do with being a sports fan or experience of watching.
Interesting. Jeff, you've been around the National Hockey League a long time. 10 years ago, the NHL publicly spoke out against NHL games being the subject of betting. 10 years later, we have the National Hockey League entering into deals with MGM Grand, and now we have a team in Las Vegas, the first team at a major league level to go into Vegas. Why the change in the approach from the National Hockey League, in your view?
Well, I think once the U.S. Supreme Court removed the prohibition, I think that probably the people at the NHL were prepared for it, and I think that they look at it as they owe their fans, they owe their club owners the opportunity to try to generate more interest in the game, more revenue in the game. Fan engagement's a big thing. The NHL is looking and working right now with player tracking devices so that they may be able to enhance the betting experience, which will drive revenues. And I think that that's probably the biggest thing with the league, is that it can create new fans, retain fans that they already currently have that may wander away from the game a little bit and create excitement.
And if I could just add one thing as far as what's changed, because it's not an NHL example, but I think it's absolutely fundamental in this discussion. 10 years ago, all of the leagues were united against sports gambling. 5 years ago, Adam Silver wrote an op-ed for the New York Times talking about why leagues should embrace gambling, and he absolutely changed the game. It was a tidal shift in how things are viewed. It was an interesting example of a commissioner not reacting, but being proactive and actually being a part of seeing where things were going and actually trying to play a role in changing how things worked. the NBA got out ahead of it, and essentially the consensus was this horse is about to get let out of the barn, and we've got one of our commissioners saying, let's go and get ahead of this and be active in it, and everyone else kind of had to come in line. That really was a huge turning point. I think history will show that as a huge turning point.
Jeff, does the current collective bargaining agreement in the National Hockey League contemplate what might happen in the event that gambling is legalized or expanded?
Not that I'm aware of. I think that it would be HRR revenue that was generated, which I think when you look at it, that's good for clubs, that's good for the league, it's good for players. It impacts not only the salary cap, puts more money in the system, and potentially has an impact on escrow, which is a bugaboo with the players.
So what are your collective predictions about legalization or further legalization of gambling in Canada? Go ahead. Start with you, Dave.
Well, one thing, again, just to clarify, because you asked about the CBAs and the league rules and regulations. Again, just because it might be legalized doesn't make it permitted as far as within the league. So the CFL and every league will have rules prohibiting players, coaches, owners, those associated with a team and with the league from gambling on that sport or that league. So even if it's legal, doesn't mean it's going to be permitted, and that's where you get the mitigation or the risk mitigation about match fixing and whatnot. If you gamble on your own sport, you're banned for life, whether that's legal, illegal, it doesn't matter. As far as where I think it will go, frankly, I think it's going to be legalized in Canada. I don't know exactly which way it'll go, provincial, federal, piecemeal. I'm not sure where that will go, but I think especially since it's been legalized in the US, it just doesn't make sense for it to be illegal here. I think that's the way things are going. And again, people are doing this. They're doing this all the time. To your point about fan engagement, all the data shows that people that are gambling on games enjoy the game more. They watch it longer. They're more invested in it. And any of the potential downside is already a big risk. So I think legalizing it just mitigates that instead of adding to it. So
and of course, in the UK, they've been permitting betting on games since games have been played, basically. So it's a big deal in the UK. It's been around forever.
If I may add to that, in 2017, I met with Interpol. They were getting key stakeholders in the Olympic movement together to talk about this issue. And it was a surprise for Canadians to hear about it and to hear that it was an issue, back to your point, David, something that's occurring today. What they told us in terms of statistics and number is that the revenues generated from illegal betting exceed the combine of revenues from prostitution, drugs, and illegal tobacco. So all of that together, the global cartel for illegal betting is bigger. If we think of how now we can enforce any rules in our current criminal code, if you try to go to your local police after a youth sport event to tell them that there's been illegal betting taking place for your event, what are they going to do? So there's no way for us in Canada with our current system and legal enforcement to even enforce the legislation that's in our criminal code. What's also true is that currently, while it's dual between the ban under the criminal act as well as a partial allowance on a provincial level, there is certain flexibility for the provinces to allow a limited amount of sports betting to take place. What's happening today is that $4 billion of our Canadian money is going to offshore betting, and only 1/8 of that number is being spent at the provincial level. So if we were to have our Canadian fans or people who are interested to bet and for that money to stay within our own system, that would already be a win, I believe. Is legal betting the solution to match fixing and the vulnerability and the threat to the integrity of sport? That I'm not sure, but I certainly think that there are options to look at with just fixing that.
Jeff, any thoughts?
I would just add that if there's a way in Canada for the government to tax us on it, they'll do it.
Spoke like a true Canadian.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to call an audible. We were going to talk about some other stuff, but the topic is current issues in sports law. Who here saw the clubbing by Matthew Garrett of the Pittsburgh quarterback on the weekend? Almost everybody. Okay, to our panel. Will his actions attract censure of the criminal justice system? Should they? Will they? Should they?
Should.
This was not an act that is a normal act within the context of already violent sport.
Yeah, and
For those of you who didn't see it, he ripped off the quarterback's helmet and cracked him over the head with it.
You know, and I think you make a good point. So I teach a sports law course at U of T, and this is kind of one of the early lessons: is when do the courts get involved? And you know, when you play, you consent to not just what's permitted within the rules of the game, but even non-permitted contact that's still within the norms of the game. So you're gonna get slashed. You're gonna, get tackled, maybe out of bounds. There's going to be physical contact that's illegal, and the punishment is a penalty. But there's above and beyond the rules and norms of the game. And if you look historically, if you use your hockey stick not as a stick but as a weapon, so Dino Ciccarelli, instead of maybe cross-checking someone, overhead smash to the head, there's been criminal prosecution. It's primarily been in Canada that it's come up. I don't know if it's come up in the States. I know, I believe Marty McSorley was an issue. I believe Ciccarelli. So it's happened here. I wouldn't be surprised if it happened in this incident. I think, to your point, we were joking right before. How many of you, I'm going to date myself for a second, how many of you have seen Happy Gilmore? So I used to use Happy Gilmore as the exaggerated point to prove a point, which is when Happy Gilmore says, one time I took my skate off and tried to stab somebody with it. No one's ever done that before. That's the absurd. This was actually pretty close. You haven't seen something like it. So I wouldn't be surprised, although, again, to my knowledge, it hasn't happened in the U.S. yet.
Brian, are you aware of any case like that in the U.S.?
I know Durbo threw a skate at a guy from the top box one time. Steve Durbano was playing in the American League, got a penalty for fighting, took off the skate and threw it at an opposing player as he skated by. But he wasn't charged.
He probably wasn't even suspended back then.
Were there any charges laid when Mike Milbury and the other Boston Bruin players went into the stands and Milbury beat somebody with his own shoe?
No. What happened with Brashear and McSorley is in Vancouver, British Columbia, any civilian that witnesses a violent act can file charges. So 3 fans called it in. The police were not going to do anything. 3 fans called it in and registered a complaint, and then the criminal system started to drive.
But you needed to have a prosecutor that thought it was worthy of a prosecution, notwithstanding.
We're very happy to get on the front page of the paper.
Yeah. Jeff?
To me, it's clearly outside of the bounds of acceptable behavior. You rip a guy's helmet off and smash him over the head while his hands are tied up. To me, that's not something that, as a quarterback, you expect that you might get drilled. They're pretty well protected these days, quarterbacks, but that type of stuff would never be contemplated. So I wouldn't be surprised if he does get charged.
It's in Ohio, and none of us have law degrees from Ohio, but presumably their view of the world will be similar to our own here, subject to what David was saying about not so many charges laid in the United States. But to pick up on David's earlier point, there are issues about do you voluntarily assume the risks of the sport? Yeah, you expect to get blocked, you might get clipped, you might have somebody give you a straight arm shiver, but you don't expect somebody to tear your helmet off and crack you over the head with it and use it to bludgeon you. And you're certainly not. The other issue is, are you consenting to the violence, which you do when you line up at the line of scrimmage, but are you consenting to this type of violence? And I would argue no. And I don't want to sound like bleeding heart liberal about it, but I think he's in danger of criminal prosecution in this case. And if you don't prosecute in this case, you never will, because this is about as egregious an example as I can think of. So that's the audible I'm calling.
Except no injury.
Yeah. That's the lucky
But
part.
should
That's
that,
going to save him.
Yeah.
maybe, yeah, quite possibly,
Didn't even cut him.
yeah. But should that save him?
I didn't mind it.
You're old school, we know that. That quarterback had it coming to him. Any questions?
I have a different view of the criminal code than you do.
Any questions from the floor? Sports law is not always the liveliest topic of the day, and maybe ill-timed at the end of the day, but hopefully our panel brought it to life a little bit. Yes, sir.
Hey guys, Rob Gignac again from Georgian College. We talked a little bit about the legality issues with marijuana in sport. You see a lot of former athletes like Rob Gronkowski, Nick Boynton, they're going out and speaking for CBD oil and how beneficial marijuana has been for them outside the sport. If we could find more, medical documents that claim what they're stating, do you see the leagues shifting their stance on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think,
CBD.
it's for sure it's permitted. As far as the league moving its stance on sponsoring or officially partnering, I think, we'd need to see a lot more as far as data. And I would need to know more about what our team doctors think. And that's ultimately the big issue. I just preach caution with data and if a retired player is getting paid and endorses it, and again, subjectivity. Someone might think it has a great impact on them. They might, enjoy the experience or feel better, and that could be a placebo effect. That could be a lot of different things. I wouldn't want to do a partnership deal with a vaping company right now either. And that's something that was a harmless equivalent that's healthier than cigarettes up until it wasn't.
Yes.
So
good point.
I don't know if this is true, but I read this a couple weeks ago. The biggest customer for CBD products, U.S. military.
interesting. Yeah.
I think that's to your point. If there's a point in the future where the science actually backs it up, it'll change the whole dynamic, because then teams will be looking at it. I mean, it's a difficult. You play football, you play hockey, any of these sports where there's contact. You're playing every night. You're traveling. These guys' bodies are completely beat up, and there's been lots of cases documented where guys get addicted to painkillers. If it gets to a point where CBD, it's not a narcotic that becomes addictive, then you'll see teams using it. But I don't think we're anywhere near that. Most of this is somewhat anecdotal from the player side. And like you said, David, if a player feels like it's making him better, then it's working in some way.
That's true.
One last comment from Dave, and then we'll wrap it up.
So I just wanted to make a point, and it was a bit a response to what was talked about in the last panel, specifically with respect to student athletes' rights, because it's something near and dear to my heart, having worked at U Sports for 3 years. But it's also a bit of a more general comment. A fan has a luxury of having a simple position that can be kind of chanted or repeated easily, right? Down with the NCAA, or the league sucks, or whatever it is. I think if you're going to be in this industry, and if you're going to be a sports lawyer or in sports business or sports management, you're stewards of a profession and an industry that means a lot to people, but you're also parts of something that has a lot of complexity and a lot of nuance. And I think when you look into a lot of these issues, you have a duty to not get persuaded by the easily chantable, easily repeatable argument, when the counter-argument might have 7 or 8 paragraphs and subparagraphs. And just very quickly, not to reopen it, but the NCAA has 460,000 student athletes across the country in 24 sports. And when we talk about player name, image, and likeness, we're talking about a small handful of men's basketball and men's football players. And so an NCAA lawyer or executive will be able to tell you a lot better than me, but there's a lot of nuance to why the system is the way it is. It's not evil people twisting their mustaches at how they can steal stuff from players. And again, trust me or don't trust me, but you owe yourself the duty, and you owe the profession the duty, to look at all that nuance, because you are in the industry and you do have a luxury of being in that position. It's a fascinating exercise, whether it's student athlete rights or any of the other issues we talk about, but don't get kind of persuaded or caught up in the very easily chantable stuff. Dig into it. You'll be rewarded for it. Your clients or your employer will be rewarded for it as well.
Thank you, Dave. Great point. That concludes this section. We've got the hockey arbitration case competition finals coming up now, so we'll clear the decks here, and we'll wait for that. Thank you all, and thanks to the panelists.